I remember the exact second my life ended, because it was the same second everyone in that church stopped seeing me as a bride and started seeing me as a mistake. The music was still playing, soft and delicate, something classical I had picked months ago when I still believed this day would mean something, when I still believed I was chosen, and I stood there at the altar in a dress that cost more than my car, my fingers trembling around a bouquet I could barely feel, staring at the man who was supposed to say forever and watching him hesitate like forever was suddenly too expensive. The silence stretched too long, longer than it should have, long enough for whispers to start crawling through the pews like a slow-moving storm, long enough for my heartbeat to become the only thing I could hear, loud and uneven in my chest. And then he exhaled, not nervous, not emotional, just done, and said, "I can't do this." Like he was canceling dinner plans instead of canceling me. I didn't move. I couldn't. My body locked in place while the room shifted around me, faces turning, eyes soft with pity or sharp with judgment, and I realized something cold and final, something I should have known all along, that I had never really belonged here, not in this room, not in his world, maybe not anywhere. My mother's voice echoed in my head, telling me to smile through discomfort, to be grateful, to not make a scene. And so I stood there, smiling just enough to pretend I was okay, while everything inside me cracked quietly, invisibly, politely. No one came to stand beside me. Not a single person stepped forward to shield me from the weight of 100 silent stares. And that was the worst part. Not the rejection, not even the humiliation, but the emptiness of realizing I was completely alone in a room that was supposed to witness the beginning of my life. I lowered my eyes because it was easier than meeting theirs, easier than seeing myself reflected back as something unwanted, and I told myself to walk away. Just turn, just leave, just disappear before the moment swallowed me whole. But my feet wouldn't listen, like some part of me was still waiting for someone to stop this, to fix it, to choose me even now. And that's when the doors opened. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for a shift in the air, a subtle change that rippled through the room before anyone even turned to look, and I felt it before I saw him. The way the whispers died mid-sentence, the way attention pulled in one direction like gravity had suddenly changed, and when I finally lifted my head, my eyes found him standing there in the doorway like he had always been meant to arrive at this exact moment. Like this wasn't interruption, but inevitability. He didn't rush. He didn't speak. He just stood there, calm, composed, completely out of place, and yet somehow the only person who didn't feel wrong in that room anymore. And for reasons I couldn't explain, my breath caught, not in fear, not entirely, but in something sharper, something unfamiliar, like the moment right before a storm breaks. And even though I didn't know his name, didn't know why he was there, didn't understand why the entire room seemed to bend around his presence, I had the sudden, terrifying sense that whatever was about to happen next would not just change this day, it would rewrite everything I thought I knew about where I belonged. No one announced him, but everyone knew he did not need to be announced, because the kind of power he carried did not rely on introductions, it silenced rooms on its own, and I watched as people shifted in their seats, as conversations died in half-finished sentences, as even my almost husband straightened like he suddenly remembered how small he was in a world that did not revolve around him. And that was when I realized this man was not just a guest who had arrived late. He was someone the room had been unconsciously waiting for. He took one step forward, then another, slow and deliberate, his polished shoes echoing softly against the marble floor, each sound precise, controlled, like he had measured this moment long before any of us ever lived it. And I could not look away even if I wanted to, because something about him held my attention in place, not forcefully, but completely, the way gravity holds everything without asking permission. My hands tightened around the bouquet, the stems pressing into my palms as if to remind me I was still here, still standing, still the girl who had just been left at the altar, but that identity was already starting to feel distant, like it belonged to someone else, someone weaker, someone who had been waiting to be chosen. He stopped a few feet away from me, close enough that I could see the details now, the sharp lines of his jaw, the stillness in his expression, the kind of stillness that did not come from calm, but from control, the kind that said nothing about him was accidental. And when his eyes met mine, everything else blurred, not dramatically, not like in a movie, but subtly, like my focus had narrowed to a single point and everything outside of it had lost its importance. There was no pity in his gaze, no hesitation, no confusion about what had just happened, and that alone made my chest tighten, because for the first time since the words "I cannot do this" had been spoken, I was not being looked at like something broken. I was being seen, fully, directly, without apology. I heard someone whisper his name behind me, too quiet to fully catch, something Italian, something that carried weight, but I did not need to understand it to feel what it meant, and I became aware of the subtle shift around him. The men in dark suits who had entered after him now standing at a respectful distance, not crowding, not drawing attention, but present enough to make it clear that nothing in this room would happen without his awareness. My heart should have been racing from fear, from uncertainty, from everything that did not make sense, but instead there was something steadier building beneath it, something that felt dangerously close to curiosity, and that frightened me more than anything else. He glanced briefly toward the man who had just rejected me, and it was not a long look, not even a harsh one, but it was enough to make that man step back, enough to make him look away first, and that was when the balance of the entire room shifted in a way that could not be undone. Then his attention returned to me, unwavering, as if the rest of the world had already been dismissed, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low, controlled, carrying easily through the silence without ever rising. He said, "Then she is mine," and the words did not sound like a claim made in impulse or arrogance. They sounded like a decision that had already been made long before this moment, a conclusion instead of a reaction, and I felt it land not just in the room but inside me, deep and unsettling, because for the first time in my life, I was not being rejected or overlooked or quietly accepted out of obligation. I was being chosen, and I did not know whether to run from it or to stay exactly where I was. I should have said no. That is what any normal person would have done: step back, shake my head, laugh it off like some absurd misunderstanding. But my body did not follow logic. It followed something else, something quieter and more dangerous, and I felt my breath catch as every eye in the room snapped back to me, waiting, judging, measuring what I would do next as if my answer would define the entire moment. I swallowed, my throat dry, my voice unsteady when I finally found it. I said, "I do not even know you," and it came out softer than I intended, less like a protest and more like a confession, and for a second I hated that, hated how small I sounded, how unsure, how much I still felt like the girl who had just been left standing alone in front of everyone. But he did not react the way I expected. There was no irritation, no amusement, no dismissal. He simply studied me, his gaze steady and unreadable, as if my words had not challenged him at all, as if they were part of something he had already accounted for. "You do not need to," he replied, his voice just as calm, just as certain, and that answer should have unsettled me more than it did, but instead it pulled me deeper into something I could not quite name, something that made the rest of the room feel distant and irrelevant. Behind me, I heard movement, my almost husband shifting, clearing his throat like he was about to reclaim control of a situation he had already lost, and for a brief moment I thought he might say something, might try to pull me back into the life I had been seconds away from committing to, but he did not, because the man in front of me did not even need to look at him again. The silence itself held him in place, and I realized then that whatever power this stranger carried, it was absolute in ways I did not understand. My fingers loosened around the bouquet, petals brushing against my wrist as my grip weakened, and I became suddenly aware of how ridiculous I must look, dressed in white, standing between two completely different futures, one that had just rejected me and one that was claiming me without hesitation, and neither of them felt entirely real. I shook my head slightly, more to myself than to him, trying to gather something solid, something that belonged to me. "I am not something you can just take," I said, and this time there was more strength in it, more truth, because I needed there to be. I needed to believe that I still had control over my own life even if everything else had just fallen apart. For the first time, something shifted in his expression, not anger, not offense, but something quieter, almost like approval, and he stepped closer, not enough to invade my space, just enough to make his presence impossible to ignore, and when he spoke again, his voice dropped slightly, not louder, just more focused. "I am not taking you," he said. "I am choosing you." And the difference between those two things landed harder than anything else that had happened so far. Choosing. No one had ever used that word for me before. Not like this. Not without hesitation or condition or expectation attached. And I felt it settle somewhere deep in my chest, unsettling and grounding at the same time. I glanced around the room, at the guests who had witnessed my humiliation only minutes ago, at the man who could not even meet my eyes anymore, at the life that had already started to feel like something I had imagined rather than lived. And then I looked back at him, at the only person in that room who had not once looked at me like I was something less. And I realized I was standing at the edge of a decision I had never planned to make, one that terrified me in ways I could not explain. Because walking away would mean returning to a version of myself that had just been proven invisible, and staying would mean stepping into a world I did not understand, with a man I did not know, but who somehow seemed to know exactly what he was doing. And that was the moment I understood something I would not fully accept until much later, that this was not about being saved, and it was not about being claimed. It was about whether I was willing to finally stop being overlooked, even if it meant trusting the one person who refused to look away. The silence did not break all at once. It cracked slowly, like something fragile under pressure, whispers returning in low waves, shifting from shock to curiosity, from curiosity to something sharper, something that felt too close to judgment, and I felt it all without looking away from him, because looking away now would have meant losing whatever fragile ground I had just found. My heart was still unsteady, but it was no longer racing from panic. It was changing, adjusting to something new, something that felt dangerously close to control, and I realized with a quiet, unsettling clarity that I was no longer reacting, I was choosing, even if I did not fully understand what I was choosing yet. His hand moved then, slow enough that I saw it coming, giving me time to step back if I wanted to, time to refuse, time to reclaim the space between us, but I did not move, and when his fingers lightly closed around my wrist, it was not forceful, not possessive in the way I had feared. It was steady, grounding, like he was anchoring me in a moment that could have easily swept me away. "You should not stay here," he said, his voice lower now, meant only for me. And I felt the words more than I heard them, felt the intention behind them, calm but absolute, as if the decision had already been made and he was simply giving me the chance to follow it willingly. I glanced past him, back toward the altar, toward the man who had just walked away from me. And for the first time since it happened, I really saw him, not as the center of my world, not as the person I had built my future around, but as someone small, uncertain, already fading into the background of a life I no longer recognized. And something inside me shifted permanently, something that did not hurt the way I expected it to, something that felt more like release than loss. The bouquet slipped from my fingers then, falling softly to the floor between us, white petals scattering against polished marble, and no one moved to pick it up. No one spoke, because somehow everyone understood that whatever this moment was, it did not belong to them anymore. I looked back at him, at the man who still held my wrist with that same controlled steadiness, and I searched his face for something I could hold on to, something that would make sense of all of this. But all I found was certainty, unshaken, unwavering, the kind of certainty I had never seen directed at me before. "Where are you taking me?" I asked, and this time my voice did not tremble, not because I was not afraid, but because the fear had changed. It was no longer about what I was losing. It was about what I was stepping into. "Away from this," he answered simply, his eyes flicking briefly toward the room, toward the expectations and judgments and quiet dismissals that had defined me for longer than I cared to admit, and then back to me, as if none of it mattered unless I allowed it to. That should have sounded vague, even dangerous, but it did not. It sounded precise in a way that made everything else feel unclear by comparison, and I realized I was standing at the edge of something that did not offer guarantees, only direction. His grip loosened slightly, not releasing me, just enough to remind me that I still had a choice, that I could pull away, step back, return to the familiar version of my life that had just rejected me so completely, and for a second I considered the safety of what I already knew, even if it had never truly been mine. But then I looked around one last time, at the faces that had watched me fall apart without stepping in, at the man who could not even look at me now, and I understood something I had been avoiding for years. There was nothing here for me to return to. I took a small step forward instead, closing the distance. He had left open, and that was all it took, his hand tightening just slightly in response. Not pulling, not forcing, just acknowledging, and without another word, he turned, guiding me with him as he walked toward the doors, and I followed. Not because I had nowhere else to go, but because for the first time, I felt like I was finally going somewhere that might actually be mine. The doors closed behind us with a soft, final sound that echoed louder in my chest than it did in the empty hallway. And just like that, the noise of the church, the whispers, the stares, the version of me that had stood frozen at the altar, all of it felt distant, like something I had watched happen to someone else instead of lived through myself. And I did not realize how tightly I had been holding my breath until I stepped outside, and the cool air hit my face, sharp and grounding, pulling me back into my body. He did not let go of my wrist, not immediately, and I noticed that now, not as something alarming, but as something deliberate, like he understood that if he released me too soon, I might second-guess everything, might turn around, might run back to a life that had already made it clear it did not want me. The black car waiting at the curb looked like it belonged to another world entirely, sleek and polished, the kind of car people glanced at twice without knowing why. And as soon as we approached, the driver stepped out and opened the rear door without a word, without hesitation, like this moment had been expected long before I had even considered leaving that church. I paused just slightly, my steps slowing as I stared at the open door, the dark interior, the unknown waiting inside. And for the first time since I walked away, doubt pressed in again, quiet but persistent, because stepping into that car meant there was no easy return, no pretending this had been a moment of shock or impulse. It meant I was choosing something entirely different, something I could not control. "You can still walk away," he said, his voice calm, almost detached, but his hand did not release mine. Not yet, and that contradiction settled somewhere deep in me, because he was giving me the option while making it clear that he already knew my answer. I looked up at him then, really looked this time, at the man who had stepped into my life without warning and shifted everything in a matter of minutes. And I searched for uncertainty, for hesitation, for any sign that this was as impulsive for him as it felt for me. But there was none, only that same steady certainty, the kind that did not demand but did not waver either. "Why me?" I asked again, softer now, not challenging, just needing something real to hold on to, something that made sense in a situation that had none, and he held my gaze for a moment before answering, long enough that I felt the weight of his attention settle around me like something tangible. "Because you did not beg," he said simply, and I blinked, caught off guard, because that was not the answer I expected, not the one I had been preparing myself for. And he continued before I could respond, "You stood there, and even after everything, you did not ask to be chosen. You just refused to disappear, and something about that made it impossible to ignore you." The words landed quietly, but they stayed, echoing in a way that made my chest tighten, because he was right. I had not begged, not because I was strong, but because I had learned long ago that begging did not change anything, and hearing someone notice that, value that, shifted something inside me in a way I could not fully explain. His hand finally loosened then, not pulling away completely, just enough to let me decide, and I looked at the open car door one more time, at the reflection of myself faintly visible in the tinted glass, still and white, still standing at the edge of something uncertain, and I realized that for the first time, the choice in front of me was not about pleasing someone else or fitting into a life that had been arranged for me. It was about stepping into something unknown simply because I wanted to. Know what would happen if I did. I took a breath, steady this time, and stepped forward, sliding into the car without looking back, and the door closed behind me with a quiet certainty that felt like a beginning instead of an ending. The car door sealed the world, outside with a soft click, and for a moment, everything went quiet in a way that felt almost unreal, like I had stepped into a space where time moved differently, slower, more controlled, and I sat there, hands resting in my lap, still in my wedding dress, still trying to catch up to a decision I had already made. The interior smelled faintly of leather and something clean, something expensive but not overwhelming, and I became suddenly aware of how out of place I must look, layers of white fabric gathered around me, hair pinned perfectly for a ceremony that never happened, sitting in a car that did not belong to anything I had ever known. He entered after me without hurry, the door closing with the same quiet precision. And when he sat beside me, the space shifted again, not smaller, but more defined, like everything in the car adjusted around his presence without him needing to do anything at all. The driver pulled away smoothly, no sudden movement, no wasted motion, and I felt the gentle acceleration as the church disappeared behind us. Not dramatically, not in some cinematic blur, just gradually, like it had already stopped matching the moment I walked out of those doors. I stared straight ahead at first, watching the city move past the tinted windows, familiar streets that suddenly felt distant, like I was seeing them from someone else's life, and I realized I had not asked the most important question yet, the one that should have come before everything else. "Who are you?" I said finally, my voice quieter than I intended, but steady enough to hold its ground, and he did not answer immediately, which somehow made the moment feel more intentional, like he chose when to speak instead of reacting out of habit. "Lorenzo De Luca," he said after a second, his tone even, unhurried, like his name was not something that needed emphasis, like it carried its own weight without explanation, and I repeated it silently in my head, letting it settle, letting it connect to the whispers I had half heard in the church, to the subtle reactions of everyone who had seen him walk in, to the quiet authority that followed him without effort. That name should have meant more to me then. It did, but all I felt was the growing awareness that I had stepped into something larger than I understood, something that did not need to explain itself to me right away. "And what does that mean?" I asked, turning slightly toward him now, because I needed clarity, needed something that would anchor me in reality instead of leaving me drifting between questions I did not know how to ask. His gaze shifted to me, not sharp, not invasive, just present, fully attentive in a way that made it impossible to pretend I was invisible. And for a moment I wondered if he would dismiss the question, if he would tell me it did not matter, but instead he said, "It means I do not make decisions I intend to undo." And the simplicity of that answer landed harder than anything more detailed could have. I studied him, searching for something beneath the words, some sign that this was impulsive or temporary, but there was nothing like that, only the same steady certainty I had seen from the beginning, and I felt a quiet tension build in my chest, not fear exactly, but awareness, the kind that comes when you realize the ground beneath you has shifted and there is no immediate way back. "You barely know me," I said. And there was something fragile in that truth, something that felt too exposed now that I had said it out loud. But he did not look away, did not soften, did not hesitate. "I know enough," he replied, and that answer should have frustrated me, should have made me push harder, demand more. But instead it made me pause, because part of me understood what he meant, even if I could not fully explain it. The car turned onto a quieter street, the noise of the city fading slightly, and I leaned back against the seat, letting the steady motion ground me as my thoughts tried to catch up, because nothing about this felt normal, nothing about this made sense in the way my life used to. And yet there was a strange clarity in it, a feeling that for once, I was not being pulled in a direction by someone else's expectations. I was moving forward because I had chosen to step into something unknown. I glanced at him one more time, at the man who had changed everything. In less than an hour, and I realized something that settled deeper than I expected. I was not sitting beside a stranger anymore, not entirely, because whether I understood him or not, whether I trusted him yet or not, I had already crossed the line that separated my old life from whatever this was, and there was no going back to who I had been before I stepped into this car. The car slowed gradually, the movement so smooth I barely noticed it until the city outside the window shifted from crowded streets and bright storefronts to something quieter, cleaner, more controlled. And I felt it again, that subtle awareness that I was being taken somewhere intentional, not random, not impulsive, every turn chosen, every second accounted for in a way that made my chest tighten with a mix of anticipation and unease. I had stopped asking where we were going, not because I did not care, but because I had begun to understand that the answer would come when he decided it should, not when I demanded it. And strangely, that did not feel like a loss of control anymore. It felt like stepping into a structure I had never been part of before, one where decisions were made with certainty instead of hesitation. The car finally came to a stop in front of a building that did not need to announce itself to be impressive, tall without being overwhelming, glass reflecting the late afternoon light in a way that made it look untouchable, like the kind of place people passed by and assumed they would never step inside. And I felt my breath slow as I took it in, realizing this was not just somewhere he stayed. This was part of who he was, controlled, precise, removed from everything unnecessary. The driver stepped out first, opening the door on my side. And for a second I hesitated again, not because I wanted to turn back, but because stepping out would make everything real in a way that sitting in the car had not. It would mean I was no longer in transition. I had arrived. He did not rush me, did not speak, but I could feel his attention shift toward me, waiting, not impatient, just aware, and that was enough to push me forward. I stepped out carefully, gathering the edge of my dress, the fabric brushing against the pavement in a way that reminded me how out of place I still looked, a bride without a wedding, standing in front of a building that felt like it belonged to a completely different version of reality. The doors opened before we even reached them, not automatically, but because someone inside had been watching, anticipating, and that realization sent a quiet ripple through me, because it confirmed what I had been slowly starting to understand. Nothing about this was accidental. Inside, the air was cool and still, the kind of silence that did not feel empty but controlled, and I became aware of the subtle shifts around us. People who did not stare but noticed, who did not question but acknowledged his presence with small, almost invisible gestures of respect, and I followed beside him, not pulled, not guided physically anymore, just moving with him because stopping now would have felt unnatural. The elevator doors opened without delay, and we stepped inside alone, the space enclosed and quiet. And for the first time since leaving the church, there was nothing to distract me, nothing to soften the reality of being here with him. And I felt the questions rise again, stronger now, more urgent, because this was no longer a moment. It was becoming a situation I needed to understand. "Why did you come there today?" I asked, turning slightly toward him as the elevator began to move, my voice steady but searching, because that question had been sitting beneath everything else, waiting for the right moment to surface. He did not answer right away, and I watched his reflection in the mirrored wall, composed, unreadable, like he was deciding how much to give me, how much I was ready to hear. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, more deliberate. "I was not there for the wedding," he said, and that answer sent a small, sharp shift through me, because it meant this had never been coincidence, never been a random interruption in my life. "Then why?" I pressed, because now I needed to know, needed something solid to hold on to before I let myself go any further into this. His eyes met mine through the reflection, steady, unflinching, and he said, "I was there for you." And the simplicity of it landed heavier than any explanation could have, because it meant that everything that had happened, every second of that day, had been moving toward this moment in a way I had never seen coming. And as the elevator continued to rise, I realized that whatever I had stepped into was not just unexpected. It was something that had been waiting for me long before I ever knew it existed. The elevator continued its smooth ascent, each passing floor marked by a quiet, almost imperceptible shift, but I barely noticed the numbers anymore, because his words had settled into my chest in a way that made everything else fade. "I was there for you." And I kept repeating it in my head, trying to understand how something like that could be true, how someone like him could have been there, watching, waiting for someone like me. "That does not make sense," I said finally, my voice softer now, not defensive, just honest, because I needed something more than a statement. I needed a reason, something I could hold on to that would make this feel less like stepping into a story that was not mine. He did not look away this time, not even for a second, and I noticed that about him. The way he never avoided a question, he only decided how much of the answer I was ready to hear, and that realization both steadied and unsettled me at the same time. "It does not need to make sense yet," he replied, and there was no dismissal in it, no impatience, just certainty, the kind that did not rush understanding but did not question itself either. And I felt a quiet frustration rise in me, not at him exactly, but at the situation, at how easily he seemed to exist inside something I could not fully see. The elevator slowed, then stopped, the doors opening to a space that felt different immediately, not just in appearance, but in atmosphere, quieter, more private, like we had stepped into a part of the world that did not allow uncertainty to linger for long. He stepped out first this time, not pulling me, not waiting, just moving forward with the same steady intention, and I followed, because stopping now would have meant admitting I was not ready for what I had already chosen. The hallway was silent, soft lighting reflecting off polished surfaces, everything in its place, everything intentional. And when we reached the door at the end, it opened before he even touched it, and I felt that same awareness again, that everything here moved in anticipation of him, not reaction. Inside, the space was expansive but not overwhelming, clean lines, muted tones, nothing unnecessary, and I stepped in slowly, my eyes taking in details without fully processing them, because my attention kept pulling back to him, to the fact that I was here, in his space, in a reality that had not existed for me just hours ago. The door closed behind us, sealing the silence, and for the first time since we left the church, there was no one else, no driver, no staff, no distant observers, just the two of us and the weight of everything that had not been said yet. I turned to face him fully, the distance between us small but noticeable, enough to remind me that I could still step back if I wanted to, that I was not being cornered, and yet I did not move. "You were watching me before today," I said, not a question this time, but a realization that had been forming since the moment he said he was there for me, and I saw the smallest shift in his expression, not surprise, not denial, just acknowledgement, like I had reached a point he expected I would. "Yes," he answered simply, and the directness of it sent a quiet ripple through me, because there was no attempt to soften it, no attempt to hide it, just truth presented without hesitation. "For how long?" I asked, my voice steady even as my thoughts started to race, because this was no longer about coincidence or timing. This was something intentional, something planned in a way I did not understand. "Long enough to know you would not break," he said, and that answer settled into me in a way that was both grounding and unsettling, because it meant he had seen parts of me no one else had noticed, parts one had not even acknowledged myself. I let out a slow breath, my gaze dropping for a second before lifting again, meeting his eyes with something new, something that was no longer just uncertainty or fear, but something closer to understanding, even if it was incomplete. "And if I had?" I asked quietly, and this time there was something more personal in the question, something that felt exposed, because I was asking about a version of myself I had almost become. He stepped closer then, not abruptly, not invading, just enough to close the space between us in a way that felt intentional, and his voice lowered slightly when he answered. Then I would have stepped in sooner, and the certainty in that statement did not feel like control. It felt like inevitability, like no matter how this day had unfolded, he would have been there, one way or another. And I realized in that moment that I had not just walked away from something that was not meant for me. I had stepped directly into something that had been waiting, quietly, patiently, until I was finally ready to see it. His words did not echo, they settled, deep and quiet, like something that had always been waiting for a place to land. And I stood there, still in the dress that no longer meant what it was supposed to, facing a man who had just admitted that my life had intersected with his long before I ever realized it. And instead of panic, instead of the fear I should have felt, there was something else rising slowly, something steadier, something that felt dangerously close to clarity. I turned slightly, taking in the room again, the clean lines, the controlled stillness, the absence of anything unnecessary, and I realized that everything about his world was intentional, nothing left to chance, nothing accidental. And that included me now, whether I fully understood it or not. I should have felt trapped, I thought, but I did not, because nothing about this felt like being cornered. It felt like being seen too clearly to hide behind the version of myself I had spent years maintaining. "You planned this," I said quietly, not accusing, just acknowledging what had become impossible to ignore, and he did not deny it, did not soften it. He simply met my gaze and said, "I prepared for it." And the distinction mattered more than I expected, because planning meant control over me, but preparing meant something else, something that left room for my choice, even if he had always been certain of what that choice would be. I let out a slow breath, my fingers brushing lightly against the fabric of my dress as if grounding myself in something physical, something real, because everything else felt like it existed just beyond full understanding, and I realized that I was no longer trying to find a way back. I was trying to understand how far forward I was willing to go. "What happens now?" I asked, and this time there was no hesitation in my voice, no uncertainty, Just a direct question that demanded an answer I could stand on. And he did not look away, did not delay. He said, "Now you decide what this becomes." And that answer shifted something fundamental inside me. Because for the first time since he had walked into that church, he placed the next step entirely in my hands. I studied him, searching for any sign that this was a test, a challenge, something I could fail. But there was nothing like that. Only that same steady presence, the same certainty that did not pressure but did not retreat either. And I understood then that whatever this was, it was not built on force or urgency. It was built on something far more dangerous: choice. I moved slowly, taking a few steps further into the room, the soft sound of my heels against the floor the only noise breaking the silence. And I stopped near the window, looking out at the city below, the same city I had woken up in that morning. But it felt different now, smaller somehow, like the life I had been living in it no longer fit the version of me standing here. I caught my reflection faintly in the glass: white dress, composed posture, eyes that no longer looked uncertain in the same way they had just hours ago. And I realized that I was not the same person who had walked down that aisle expecting to be chosen. I was someone who had walked away and chosen something else instead. I turned back to him, meeting his gaze without hesitation this time. And I felt the shift fully settle into place, the fear no longer leading, the uncertainty no longer controlling, replaced by something quieter but stronger: awareness, intention, and something that felt like the beginning of control. "I do not know what this is yet," I said, my voice calm, steady, and completely my own, "but I am not walking away from it." And the moment the words left me, I knew they were true, not because of him, not because of what he offered or what he represented, but because for the first time, I was not waiting to be chosen, I was deciding to stay. And that difference changed everything. Because he did not save me from being left behind. He gave me a place where I was never invisible to begin with.